Hi, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. I want to talk about applying IBS methodology to large segments or to even entire main units or even biblical books as a whole. Inductive Bible study is a process that, as you know, takes you from essentially survey all the way through application. So you can come to a text that you've never looked at before and you essentially have a roadmap, again, to take it from not knowing much about the text all the way to fully developing an interpretation and then evaluating its levels of applicability and then actually appropriating it and applying it into our modern lives. So let me talk about how to do that. It's not just a roadmap, but it's also essentially a time management method, because the assumption is that we don't have time to exhaustively study a whole passage. Like for this class, many of the assignments are supposed to be done in a short amount of time, maybe 8 or 10 hours maximum. And you can do something substantial with that as long as you use inductive Bible study to help you focus. And I want to talk about how to do that. And I want to use as an illustration the text Genesis 2:4 to 4:26. And the assumption here would be, well, I'll give you a couple of assumptions. There's actually multiple ways to begin to study the passage. The two of the easiest ones are the ones that I'm going to talk about right now. And I would suggest using one of these two methodologies for our class. There's always going to be another option, which is essentially, in this course, I will give you questions that you can use to launch into interpretations if you don't want to follow your own way. But let me show you a couple of ways that if you're working on your own, which everybody in this class will be eventually generating materials, whether it's for teaching or for preaching or maybe even for writing some kind of a curriculum. So let's talk about how you do that. One method, which we're typically starting with this semester, is you start with a survey. And again, it's a survey of whatever size material you're working with. So in this case, this is a segment within the book of Genesis. And the survey does a couple of things. And essentially with your survey, you're working through breaking the text into main units and subunits. Then you're looking for structural laws or structural relationships. These two steps are structure, or what we would mean by structure, but again, it's the main units and subunits and structural relationships. And then essentially the rest of the survey is going to flow from these elements. And what I mean by that is, what do? For each structural relationship, you have a set of questions, which are structure-based questions. So each structure has its own set of questions. And you're going to ask three kinds. Again, definitional. What is the meaning of? Again, you can look at the sheet that I supplied that talks about, that gives models for the list of structures and gives model questions. But definitional, what is the meaning of? What is involved? Rational, it's a why question. And then implicational question, what are the full implications of this? And again, in terms of methodology, you always want to start with definitional, and you have to answer the definitional and the rational before you can even start messing around with the implicational ones. Then you also are going to have strategic areas. And this is going to be important. I'm going to show you why in a minute. The strategic areas are also connected to the structure. So questions come off of structure and strategic areas do. So for every structure that you've identified, you want to make sure that you have a strategic area that is connected with it. So if you have 5 structures, you need to have a strategic area that would take care of each one of those 5. Now, if you find a strategic area that can actually encompass 2 or 3 of the structures, that's ideal, because that then gives you focus where the structures are overlapping. But again, Structural relationships lead to questions, lead to strategic area. Again, the other parts of the survey are a little more straightforward. You just talk about the literary form. Like, so for example, on Genesis 2:4-26, that would be narrative. There is poetry in the Pentateuch. There's law. There's hortatory sections. Those are what we mean by literary form. Then atmosphere. What's the tone? Give a couple of adjectives that describe the atmosphere in a situation, and then save a section for major impressions. So this is kind of a miscellaneous category that you can fill in with things that you don't want to lose that you saw in your survey, maybe minor structures that aren't quite major, maybe themes that didn't quite fit into the structures, but you can grab data here. So that's the survey. Okay, so one of the ways to move into interpretation and in the instructions for the assignments, I'm basically pointing to really two options. Option one is to do this. Since you're starting with the survey, what you want to do is you pick the structure from your survey that seems to be the major structure out of all the structures that you've identified. So for example, in Genesis 2:4 to 4:26, the most obvious structure I think that you'd want to work on is the cruciality that takes place in Genesis 3:1-7. Again, if you recall, you essentially have this type of cruciality where things are moving in a positive direction. Then you have the pivotal passage, which is Genesis 3:1-7, and then that reverses and it leads to a negative climax really throughout the rest of the segment, but especially by 3:24. You can argue that this continues into chapter 4, but it at least goes to 3:24. So notice that this structure really covers 2/3 of the material, right? And so one of the ways to do the interpretation is to work off of this cruciality, and then what would be the strategic area for cruciality. And so once you picked your big structure, what you want to begin with is the strategic area for that structure. And so our interpretation would begin with Genesis 3:1-7, and the way you begin your interpretation is you go back to your structure-based questions. Start with a definitional question, like we're going to start with what precisely and specifically is involved in the dialogue between the serpent and Eve, and how does it lead to the decision of Adam and Eve to disobey God? So there's our question. There's our interpretive question to start the interpretation, because you always want to start your interpretation with a question. What is it that you're trying to interpret? So again, where did I get this question from? I got this question directly out of my survey. Again, if you're doing this on your own, you do a survey, find the big structure, pick the strategic area for that structure, start with probably a definitional question, or you can do a couple of smaller ones if you want to, and then start with your strategic area as your immediate context. So the first thing I would do is begin doing observations and inferences from the immediate context. Here in this case, this would be Genesis 3:1-7. And you're going to make observations from here and inferences that would help you to answer the interpretive question that you've asked. Again, what's the interpretive question? I'll write it up here, but essentially I'm going to summarize it. What precisely is involved in the pivotal passage three, 1-7, and how does it lead to disobedience? So notice what that question does. That grabs a lot of data there. It's focused on immediate context, but it's also going to talk about how this leads to a wider disobedience. And so then, after we've made lots of observations and inferences, and again, these inferences would be partial answers to your interpretive question. You're going to get some data. Then you go to the next level. And the next level here in context is going to be segment as a whole, segment context. Again, in terms of time spent, most of the time is here, and then you can have a little bit of time then to look at the wider segment. What else in Genesis 2, 3, and 4 can help you to answer this specific question? And there'll be a little bit less, and then you can take it out to the wider book. Again, as much as you have time. Again, these are elements that you want to include, but this is going to be the major focus. You'll get a little bit less data here, even less here. Now, what do you do after you've gone this far in this type of interpretation? What you want to ask yourself is, what else do I need to know to fill this out? And then here, you're going to add other determinants as time allows. So maybe word study. And again, I'm suggesting for this class, you can do limited word studies. I do a video on how to use Blue Letter Bible, a free online resource to be able to do original language word studies. You'd want to limit it because the Pentateuch is vast, the Old Testament's vast. So you do limited word studies. You're also free to go ahead and use published word studies if you have access to those types of things and resources. You can also do historical background. That would be the use of Bible dictionaries, whether it's like an Erdman's Dictionary of the Bible, or if you have one of the InterVarsity or IVP background Bible commentary things that go with the historical background, you can use that. So this would be things like word study, historical background, original language work. This would be syntax. Essentially any source of data that can help you fill in what you did in context. And then the last thing that you want to do with your interpretation is interact with commentaries or other scholars. So you can use scholarly articles or commentaries in this section here, and you want to look at least two. Two is the minimum. And then the last thing you do is you do a synthesis or a summary that pulls together your insights. Okay, so this is one way to do survey and interpretation in a large section. Again, what did I do? You start with a survey. Once you're done, you make a judgment. What's the biggest structure? Take the definitional question from that big structure, start there, and then use the strategic area from that structure and begin to work through the process. Again, the focus is on context. You want to grab evidence from context, and this is one way to do interpretation for this class. Now, the second way for this class is you're going to do a survey for most of the segments, but then the interpretation, you can also take one of the questions that I have given you and apply it to the text that I suggest, and then work in immediate context, run the same process. Where do I get the questions that I'm asking? Most of those come out of my survey work, just in case you didn't know. So you're free in this class to work out your own method to practice going from your own survey to an interpretation and an interpretive agenda that you generate. You're also free, once you've done your own survey, to use the questions that I suggest if you want to just work on something and you feel more comfortable answering the questions that I raise. Okay, now, let me suggest another way to do inductive Bible study. And this would involve work without actually doing a survey if you don't have time, like down the road. So a couple easy ways. If you're a pastor and you're like preaching from the lectionary, or you're actually assigned a text, you can do IBS this way. So if you already know what your text is, let's say, for example, you've been asked to preach on, let's say, the Sabbath, on Genesis 2, 1-3. How do you start an interpretation here? If you're starting just with a text, the easiest way, instead of doing survey, then, is you'd start with a detailed observation. Of this, which, if you remember what that is, that's observations. And then questions. In the way that is modeled in the Bauer-Traina book, or if you've had me previously, observation, and then for every observation, so if you have an observation here, you then generate a definitional, rational, and an implicational question for each of the observations that you make. So after you've made a sufficient number of observations and questions, what you then do at the end of this process is you ask yourself, what is the most critical question? And that could be a plural also. It could be questions, what is or what are the most important or most critical question or questions. And then take a couple of those questions, and that becomes your agenda for interpretation. So you can move directly from your detailed observation to here. Again, what's your question that you're going to start with? It would be one of the questions that you've asked in the detailed observation, or related ones, and then you're going to do the same thing that we did previously. You do your work through your context. So immediate, context, segment. So you want to step back and try to figure out what's the larger section this passage is. So in this case, it would be 2, 1-3. The segment would be 1, to 2, 3. And then, your book as a whole would be the rest of the book of Genesis. So you'd have this this would be your context. You'd add other determinants as needed to make sense of things. So again, word study, historical background, original language materials. We'll add a few other things here and there as we have time this semester. And then the last thing, again, would be, so you'd have your different determinants or extra ones. And then the last thing you would do would be look at commentaries. And then summary or synthesis. So that's a couple of different ways that you can work through interpretation. And if you go back and you look at the notes that I have for 2:4 to 426, you can see how I've moved from my survey to some interpretation. Again, you can always do more on all of these things, but I tried to limit my time, so I kind of gave you a interpretation that looks at least achievable or attainable versus one that's completely exhaustive. But it models this method where you start with your structural questions and then you run it through our grid till you reach a summary. Again, and you're free to work out your own method doing something like this. And if you're on your own, you also have the option of picking a passage. If you're not going to do the survey, start with detailed observation and then moving into interpretation that way. I hope this video helps you. Feel free to send me some questions, and I look forward to continuing to receive outstanding work from you this semester. Again, I'm Brian Russell, and thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.